This blasphemous image makes me feel uneasy.
Lovecraft games. We all want to play them. There's just something so addictive about the truly modern feeling of cosmic horror that H.P. Lovecraft created, about sinking down into the murky, benthic depths of the mind and allowing insanity to take over when you realize the hopeless inadequacy on a universal scale of the human species. Cosmic horror is so effective and gets better and better every year that passes because of how new and modern it was 100 years ago, how ahead of its time. It's horror that eschews the more primitive notions of an evil beast ripping off your skin, or the horror of a vampire or a demon stealing your soul. Those kinds of horror are too rooted in the very atavistic, old-fashioned physical fears of having your body harmed on the one hand, or the terribly outdated medievalist quasi-religious notions of your spirit or soul being taken away by a supernatural entity. Lovecraft wrote horror for the modern age, for the age of science, for the age of reason. He wrote horror for the time when people were actually able to look around and say that it's the height of folly to believe that the devil even cares if we live or die at all. It's the horror we get when we question the value of human life on the cosmic scale.
There's no scientific consensus that life is important.
Lovecraftian monsters represent the hopeless loss of identity that everyone feels in the age of the masses, of mass society, masses of people, mass government, mass armies. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, and all of the horrible implications that that equation has had for us. It's the paralyzing sense of terror that you feel when you realize that you are helpless in a big, scary galaxy with some very big fish out there.
I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook.
So what better medium to explore the outer depths of cosmic horror than video games? Well, literally all of them so far. You know, like painting and sculpture and writing, of course, and film and television. All of the other genres have been better. Maybe not television, but video games have a lot of potential for telling Lovecraftian stories because we are put into the position of the person who is dealing with the elder entities and the dark gods. Also, I'm going to be completely spoiling the entire game here, so if that's a concern for you, this is your warning. Although if you're familiar with Lovecraft's work, you're not going to see anything that you don't pretty much already know about. Back in the olden days of the 80s and 90s, developers began to dip their toes into the icy, brackish waters of the Cthulhu mythos. Several point-and-click adventure games followed, most importantly Shadow of the Comet and Prisoner of Ice. Both of these games shared much more than the same developer, the French company Infogrames. The general tone, style, and spookiness of both games effectively evoked the eerie sense of foreboding otherness that all of Lovecraft's masterworks exude, like the icky stench of rotting squid. Shadow of the Comet in particular had problems. It is, and I'm being honest here, the worst point-and-click adventure interface I've ever experienced, and I mean that. No, but seriously, I think that maybe some of the more confusing puzzles in Shadow of the Comet may have been an intentional choice by Infogrames, a metagaming decision in order to drive the player insane with the absolute cosmic hopelessness of ever trying to figure out what exactly it was that you were, supposed to do to not die. But putting all that aside, the games are both positively dripping in charm, like murky slime falling off the wet, wriggling body of a hideous underwater cephalopod. All of the artistic choices apart from the gameplay itself worked beautifully, and both of those games are still great today, as long as you have a walkthrough open at all times while playing them. In the early 2000s, after the decline of the point-and-click genre and before the rebirth of the genre in the 2010s, Lovecraft was adapted into some more interactive gaming formats with an emphasis on action. One of the first games in this new, more modern 3D era of Lovecraftian video games was Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. You take on the role of Alexandria Roivas, who is destined to be the savior of humanity from the dark, eldritch creatures that are sticking their dark, icky tentacles into the veil of reality. Do you get it? Do Do you get that her name is Alexandria Roivas of the Roivas family? Roivas, it's savior, spelled backwards. Mm-hmm.
Oh my God!
Alex decides to read the Necronomicon, here repackaged as the Book of Eternal Darkness, in order to find out how her beloved grandfather had his head ripped off. We then go on a globe-hopping trip through time and space, and multiple generations of Roivases to stop the extra-dimensional gods intent on destroying humanity. Combining a tight combat system, fun and not too confusing maps, creepy monsters, and a sanity meter that went down just looking at the hideous eldritch entities, Eternal Darkness remains one of the best survival horror games ever made. I especially like when your sanity goes so low the game starts freaking out, and tries to convince you that you're going crazy by making the volume suddenly turn off, or deleting all of your save files, which really freaked me out when it first happened. But Eternal Darkness was not a direct adaptation of Lovecraft's stories. We never actually went to the Mountains of Madness, or uttered the sacred name of the great Cthulhu. The honor of making a fully modern game with all of the squidgy, splodgy, gooey, splotchy, inky, ichthyophobic,
I mean, he must have had something about fish. Really bothered him, you know?
Piscine nightmares would go to the good folks at Headfirst Productions and land on the original Xbox around Halloween of 2005, to be ported to the PC a year later. So, what happened?
Look at the mask of my boy.
And tragically, the results were, well, let's say questionable. You begin the game as police detective Jack Walters, who's been called in to examine the workings of a spooky cult that's been harassing the good folk of a small Massachusetts town, and now they mysteriously want to speak to you, which is, as far as you know, inexplicable. You have no idea what this cult is, or why they know you, or why they've been following you. It makes no sense. The opening segment of this game, this prologue here, is nothing short of great. We have a weird setting with rain drizzling down around a decrepit mansion, lunatics shooting at law enforcement, and even a mass suicide and atrocious medical experiments to discover. The game plays like a pretty standard adventure game, well, except in first person and it's in 3D, and you don't kill anybody or fight anybody, you don't even have a pistol at the start. You just send Jack around to explore, and boy does he find some stuff in this nest of crazy cultists. A pile of dead bodies, hints of torturous experiments, accidentally electrocuting a dude, by the way, who was suspended from the wall with his internal organs and strange machines around him, which still function, including his heart and brain, while somehow keeping him alive in torturous agony for no humanly comprehensible reason. And finally at the end you see a 10-foot-tall alien life form, whose very presence in this house is a blasphemous atrocity against human reason itself. For those not familiar with Lovecraft, it's going to be mysterious what's happening here, but anyone who's read The Shadow Out of Time will know what happens next. Jack's body is hijacked by aliens, and his mind is presumably sent to prehistoric Australia — no, I'm not kidding about that, that's where the aliens lived in the past — to await return to the present day. Jack only gets full control of his mind after 6 long years, and what the alien was doing with his body in that time period, he has no way of knowing. And we don't really learn anything about why the cult knows who he is and why they're stalking Jack, and our hero is left as a broken man, expelled from the police force and made to become a private detective while he earns his keep and tries to sort out his life by studying the occult. That, ladies and gents, is the beginning of an amazing game. Tragically, it's not the one we are to be playing with Dark Corners of the Earth. The mystery around Jack's past and his encounter with the great race of Yith — that's the name of the aliens — is pushed far into the background. We get occasional glimpses of him in an insane asylum. They're creepy, if a bit over the top, but that's it for a long time. Jack's first, and basically his last case of the game involves going to the town of Innsmouth and investigating the disappearance of a store owner of a grocery chain. Can you imagine working in retail and becoming a missing person, and then having your boss be so concerned about you that they phone a gumshoe to look for you instead of just forgetting about your existence forever like a real retail manager would? This opening part of Innsmouth keeps up the excellent style of the prologue. There is some questionable voice acting.
If I see you without fire, I'll report you to order.
I'll not say nothing.
But aside from that, the town is disquieting, filthy, and unwelcoming. There's a terrible sense of decay pervading all of the buildings, which are closed and boarded up. The people are half mad and talking to themselves, or exhibiting some sort of ferocious xenophobia, hinting at the spiritual decline underneath. There's definitely something wrong in Innsmouth. You might even say there's something a little bit fishy about the town. Headfirst did a great job building the setting, the people, the NPCs, the mystery to uncover. It's all there in the atmosphere. But after looking into the missing persons case in true adventure game style, you suddenly abandon the investigate and explore gameplay for the shooting, hiding, and running of an action game. As I go into the reasons why I think this game failed as a Lovecraftian horror game, I want to make it clear that this is absolutely not about the people that like the game, or even the developers, or even really exactly hating the game itself. This isn't about hating the game, this is about love. This is about loving Lovecraft, it's about loving video games, it's about loving the idea of melding Lovecraft and video games into some wonderful peanut butter and jelly sandwich with the crust cut off that we all want to enjoy. It's about trying to determine where they misstepped in order to avoid making those missteps in the future. Again, love for everything, love for everybody, love for the game. We're just trying to figure out where they went wrong, not hate on the game.
The foundation of such a method is love.
Dark Corners of the Earth failed financially, and I can tell the moment where most people were probably turned off of the game. Escape from the Fishmen. The kind folk of Innsmouth have grown a little bit too suspicious of you poking about town to let you live, so you have to bolt out of your hotel room before they serve you up with chips and tartar sauce. This entire segment is terrible. You have to open and close doors, turn bolts to lock doors. It's very finicky, by the way, where you have to click to get that done, push furniture in front of doors, and leap out of the window. And leap quite gracelessly, because the jumping mechanics in this game simply don't work well. You can die over and over again just on this one jump, and you'll probably have to do this scene over and over and over again, and people just probably got incredibly frustrated at this point. I think this is the time to mention that the devs of Dark Corners of the Earth were primarily makers of point-and-click adventure games in the 90s. Even if they hired new people that weren't on those games for this particular project, everything goes up to the head of the company, and that may have filtered down to people. They were great point-and-click adventure games, but putting the meticulous precision of item usage, or being in an exact right place to avoid an immediate grisly death without any way to resist it, and other tropes for that genre don't necessarily work in a fully realized 3D space. It's just frustrating, especially because the game includes limited saves, so you have to go back and keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And it's just not exciting, it's just finding the absolute precise way that the developers want you to do this and get this right, or face immediate death. This is the moment Dark Corners of the Earth begins its engagement with a severe sin of video gaming: directed action. Now, this is not an absolute rule, and there are definitely exceptions you can point to, but generally in a video game, you want to give the player options to explore in dealing with a problem. But Jack Walters feels much more like a beleaguered actor on a film set being yelled at by an angry director than an avatar of the player's actions. You have to follow a very careful, precise set of movements in order to escape. If you don't follow them, well, you'll watch a cutscene for the umpteenth time and do it again. Do I have to go here? Oh no, I guess I'm dead. I have to go right instead of left. Okay, I went right. What do I have to do now? Oh wait, I needed to close this door here. Okay, I closed it. I have to do this again. Okay, I'll go right, then I'll close the door, then I have to open this window. No, I have to push a door. It's all just very tedious and boring. You feel like you're just following a script, and I don't think it's a coincidence that you see a lot of film grain on the cutscenes in Dark Corners of the Earth. I think they had a action movie style that they were going for here, and it just doesn't work at all. This even happens, by the way, at the end of the game. In order to beat the game after the final boss fight, You have to run through this enormous cavern where the evil Temple of the Dagonite cultists has been built before it's blown up, and it's really hard to do it in the exact order fast enough to avoid death. I had to do this maybe over a dozen times to get it right. It's ridiculous that this would be at the final, exciting, the thrilling climax. This happens a fair amount in Dark Corners of the Earth, so you'll have to put up with this several times, and it just leads to immense frustration, and frustration doesn't lead to fun most of the time. Supposing you survive these exceptionally tedious moments and don't mind a lot of reloading, especially on your first time through the game, you'll get to the action and stealth gameplay sections. I don't think that a Lovecraftian game needs to avoid combat. In fact, I generally prefer games where force is an option, but it has to be done delicately. The fighting in Silent Hill or Resident Evil is slow, difficult, and brutal. It could sometimes take 10 bullets just to kill one zombie. It also lets you get a close-up view of the creepy creatures you have to fight. There also must be a sense of the grotesque and just disgust at being near these rotten monstrosities. The action in Dark Corners of the Earth does not succeed at this. Most of it is tiresome, boring, vaguely shooter-ish gameplay. And unlike a contemporary game, Fear, which was a shooter with horror elements, the shooting is not even any good, and that's what you're going to be doing through the vast majority of the game. It's not like you need to get through some rough edges in order to get to the real game. No, about 9/10, or maybe if I'm being charitable, 8/10 of your time in the game is more or less action or stealth action based. And that would be fine. I wouldn't be upset with that if it was a guns-blazing shooter in a Lovecraftian setting, but we kind of get stuck with the worst of both worlds here. The adventure gaming is put so far to the side it falls off and barely registers for long stretches. There are quite a few oddities to the combat, like sometimes I was able to just walk by these dudes without fighting or even hiding from them. Other times they fired with the expertise of snipers and took me down instantly. There's a great amount of smoke blown up from the pistols, making it somehow difficult to aim, the necessary 3 or 4 shots to kill an opponent. The enemies are also experts at bobbing and weaving. They're surprisingly spry for a bunch of degenerate fishmen. The best weapon I found in the early game was the double-barreled shotgun, but you naturally have to get up very close to these enemies in order to use it, and if you're getting up that close anyway, you might as well just use the melee weapon to take them down. In fact, I found myself using the melee weapons over and over again, because the guns could just be a little bit too tricky. I really only found myself enjoying the shooting when I found the bolt-action rifle weapon, which I think gave me the range and stopping power and ammunition quantity without reloading that really let the game ease up a bit in that challenge level. Investigate and explore are the two main principles of adventure gaming. Even more so, I would argue, than specifically the puzzles that this genre is known for, which act more as gates between moments of discovery. And that all perfectly fits in with horror, a genre that's based on provoking fear through gradual discovery of the strangeness and evil pervading the world that the protagonist is in. Action is about reactive aggression, excitement, resistance, and destruction of real or imagined enemies through violence. In one, you're a victim, a weakling, someone who is the object of the aggression and hatreds of others. Action is proactive, and it puts the protagonist on the offensive. It's difficult to maintain a sense of fear or dread in those circumstances. Jason Voorhees is scary because he's going after a bunch of dumb, helpless college kids. Set him up against Rambo and it becomes a very different movie. In a survival horror game, the monsters are impediments. They're obstacles in your path to escape or solving a mystery. And in the best survival horror games, you have to get right up close to them in order to kill them. They're not really the primary aim of gameplay. Dark Corners of the Earth never abandons being an adventure game totally, never. In fact, one of my favorite puzzles is towards the end of the game where you have to start using the Book of Dagon to translate mysterious runes on the wall to break a magical spell. But far, far too much of this game is a repetitive, glitchy, boring shooter that fails to capture the essence of fear in any sense, Lovecraftian or otherwise, and doesn't even succeed at being a fun action game. The enemies throughout the game are armed with a variety of firearms, shotguns, Tommy guns, pistols, which may also be a serious issue conflicting with the horror factor of the game. It sort of reminded me of the human cultists that the Silent Hill movie and later Silent Hill games started doing. It demystifies the cult and the world when you're battling random humans with guns instead of ineffable monstrosities. You're sort of battling the gun itself and the power of the gun rather than the creature. You could argue that this was a good thing by very gradually introducing the supernatural enemies, starting with deformed humans, moving to half-human, half-gill men, to finally full-on Creature of the Black Lagoon-looking Dagonites at the very end. But it all feels a bit off. It's sort of like the creatures in the Underworld series, werewolves and vampires using machine guns. There's something about using modern weapons in this scenario that limits the spookiness. Really anything could be shooting at you there, it doesn't matter that it's some sort of hideous monster. Aside from action, there's quite a bit of stealth gameplay to explore, which I think highlights another little sin that this game commits. Sid Meier, the legendary creator of the Civilization series, once said, in reference to a video game he made in the 90s, that it's better to make one good game rather than two great games. In other words, you should make sure that multiple systems or styles of gameplay shouldn't clash with one another. They can be blended together absolutely it can happen, but more often than not they undermine each other. Instead of getting one thing right, you end up getting multiple things wrong. The stealth sections are a third gameplay style along with adventure and shooter that are tossed right into the mix, and unsurprisingly it doesn't work well. It doesn't reach Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines level of broken stealth, but enemies will stop chasing you after you close a door and crouch, stealth kills don't always seem to work, you don't even seem to need stealth all the time, just as long as the enemy is facing the other way, that's all that really matters. One of the great cosmic mysteries of the game is that there is a crouch button and a sneak button, so you can sneak without crouching or crouch without sneaking, or crouch and sneak and essentially play the game in slow motion. It's very, very peculiar, and you have to do a lot of sneaking in this game, like a lot of it, so they needed to get it done correctly. And the fact that they did it severely limits the fun factor in large sections of this game. Shortly before all of this fishman chase nonsense starts, you experience an excellent moment of mysterious storytelling that is redolent of the promise this game had if it was done differently. In one of Innsmouth's houses, you will find a stereotypically sweet young girl who seems quite out of place in this horror story, until you see her painting gruesome portraits of monsters and death. She explains that her mother has been biting people, whatever that means, and locked in the attic. Naturally, we go straight up to the attic and let out her monstrous mommy with predictably terrible results.
Oh, God. No.
They've taken the last thing I loved away from me.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize what was up there. What the hell was that thing?
This is the kind of trauma that wounds the mind and generates madness, plausibly opening up Jack to the kind of mental destruction leading to his permanent incarceration in the loony bin. The ghost of the little girl will haunt you for the rest of the game, giving Jack and the player hope that maybe she survived somehow, and our sin can be expunged.
Mona?
Even though we know that the game is just taunting us, she's dead, she's just a ghost, it's our fault, and even if she lived, she was infected with the Innsmouth taint, and will turn her into a fish monster eventually, making any attempt to save her futile. And all of that is brilliant, but it's all too brief. Mostly you will be wandering around brownish-gray streets, factories, caves, police stations, all the while fighting evil fishmen, or desperately trying to hide from them. There's even a good old-fashioned car chase shootout that belongs more in the Untouchables than a Lovecraft story. Not that this all departs totally from Lovecraft's intention, there's a major raid by the government that ends the evil fish cult for good, but the meat of the story is the narrator's own journey in and escape from the town. Psychologically, the protagonist becomes despondent that he too could be a fish person, and the story ends with him becoming unhinged and busting out his rather piscine cousin from the loony bin. The climactic final battle to erase this evil from the earth does include a pretty darn awesome boss fight against Dagon himself towards the end, and I did love that moment, even though it was pretty difficult, but none of this conveys the utter helplessness and hopelessness found in Lovecraft's world. If we can affect the cosmic horrors, then they're just animals or people or monsters. They're not truly elder entities of darkness that are so powerful that we could never hope to affect them in any way or even attract their attention, except the attention of a human to an insect.
They are vast, timeless, and if they are aware of us at all, it is as little more than ants, and we have as much chance of communicating with them as an ant has with us.
Speaking of the Untouchables, by the way, the game takes a turn for the comic when you run into none other than J. Edgar Hoover. It's so much more ridiculous than it could have been if it was just a random FDI dude running things. I mean, come on, why does it have to be J. Edgar himself? We also go through a bizarre scene where he threatens Jack, beats him when he mysteriously does not comply. Why exactly is Jack not giving all of his info to the feds about the evil cultist demon worshippers? Do we not want the government to know about the evil cultists having sex with fish monsters and worshipping demons?
I mean, that's what the man's got set up here, man. It's fucking pagan idolatry. Look around you.
What motivation does he have here to resist this and be pummeled and beaten? What is the point? Also, Hoover threatens you with a return to a mental hospital permanently. But why would the FBI want to employ a man diagnosed with schizophrenic delusions in the first place? Wouldn't that be the worst possible thing to do when fighting a cult that is known for driving people insane? After running into J. Edgar Hoover, the worst part of the game is the Marsh Gold Refinery. This place looks like a generic smoke and sparks factory right out of an old action flick. The boiling gold sections even resemble the end of Terminator 2, and it goes without saying that you'll be fighting and sneaking around a bunch of fishmen. The level is spiced up a bit by the presence of a Shoggoth, the amoeba-like nightmare blob the Dagonites are trying to use to take over the world, though I think it resembles the green pleasure gilf from Red Dwarf a little bit more. The fight with it is so peculiar, because the Shoggoth remains oddly passive for no particular reason that I can see for much of the time. It just kind of sits there waiting and only reacts after you get close, and to be honest, I think it looks kind of adorable. I know it looks like some sort of hideous green blob creature, but the eyes on it sort of look oddly friendly or comical. It just doesn't look scary, it looks more amusing to me. Sometimes it chases you through the air ducts, other times it's just sort of content to sit about. The game spends a lot of time working with your insanity meter, which, unlike Eternal Darkness, is not shown with an actual meter, you just have to sort of monitor your character's reactions. Unfortunately, when you start going insane, the method they chose to show this is the screen wigging out and going through this odd primitive effect of distorting your vision for a while, and I don't really think that this works very well. They could have done this without making it hard to actually see what the heck is going on the screen. I don't really know what's happening here, it's all just fading in and out. This happens, by the way, when Jack sees heights, and that makes it even worse. It's much harder to move about and jump and move precisely. I understand what they were going for here, but I think there was a better way to convey this, instead of just distorting our ability to view what the heck is going on in front of us. You can actually totally lose your mind and die from sanity loss, but it happened almost never. The only moment it ever did for me was when I was looking at this gigantic statue of Cthulhu, which was slowly eroding my mind. I did really like this section, by the way, but considering it comes at the very end of the Smoke and Sparks factory, the pleasure of seeing this statue of Cthulhu driving me insane wasn't enough to erase the previous several hours of killing fish boys and fighting huge sentient chunks of green mucus. Yet more action awaits you after the factory when you go to the official mansion of the Cult of Dagon. You get to fight some sort of a weird Cthulhuoid monster. I guess these are the star spawn of Cthulhu that you get to immolate with a flamethrower. It's actually pretty fun, if it wasn't for all the combat. Eventually you end up on a naval vessel, going through yet another action sequence as the final fishy Dagonite form of the cultists storm the ship. And you end up going to Devil's Reef, the center of the cult, or rather the above-ground center of the cult. They really live in cities underneath the water. Well, you eventually get to Devil's Reef as long as you avoid a glitch so severe at this point that the game becomes literally unwinnable because you can't see the lights where you were actually supposed to shoot.
You call this a glitch?
And don't tell me about patching the game with the unofficial patch, because that still didn't work for me. I still got this, and it still didn't work. Yeah, so after this point I actually needed to just download save files that someone else put on the internet in order to beat the game, which is, wow. Anyway, when you reach Devil's Reef, you have to depower the huge energy shields protecting the underwater city of Dagon, so the Navy can blow it up with submarines. So wait a minute, you're telling me that the Dagonite cultists live in underwater cities and have special bubble shield technology that prevents them from being damaged by explosions, and we know for a fact that the Gungans are also an aquatic species that have underwater cities and have bubble shield technology that prevents them from being damaged by explosions. So, but wait, does that mean that the Trade Federation and the Confederacy of Independent Systems was right? Were they the good guys in all of this that were trying to destroy the Dagonite cultists? But the people who were the head of the Trade Federation were also fishmen. So was the entire movie just about a huge battle between the Dagonite cultists on one hand and some splinter, like Cthulhu worshipping group on the other, because they were in the stars and Cthulhu comes from the stars? Was Darth Jar Jar correct this entire time? Is this the hint the game is trying to provide us? Is this the key? I think this game has driven me insane. I think I have reached the Lovecraftian level of madness at the cosmic horrors of the universe. The visuals in the Dagonite Undercity are pretty darn cool. I like the weird flora on the walls, the vampiric starfish that face-hug you, and the statues of fell deities and the weird carvings of the evil, monstrous practices that the Dagonites are engaging in order to create the half-man, half-fish creatures.
This is how the population was infected with the Innsmouth taint.
What I have is a romantic abnormality. One so unbelievable that it must be hidden from the public at all costs. You see... Stop!
If only the gameplay matched up to that. This is the final level of the game, although it's split into a number of sections. I don't know if this is actually the underground city of Yanthanle, or however it's pronounced, or just some sort of fort or temple that the Dagonites use. After vainly attempting to sneak around for a while, you're imprisoned by the High Priest and forced to go into a long stealth section, crawling around on your knees in a gigantic cave area that just sort of pads out the runtime for quite a while. Once you escape and kill the leader of the cult and retrieve your weapons, the game is brought to an appropriately thrilling conclusion when you discover a secret chamber below the temple that was presumably built by the great race of Yith. And there's even a fun boss fight against the flying polyps, these strange alien creatures that were the arch nemesis of the Yith back in prehistoric Australia. So once you gather your weapons, you do get to engage in that boss fight I mentioned before against Dagon himself, this gigantic fishy monster creature as the Dagonite offspring assault you from all sides. There's even some attempts to make the story a little more layered, because we find out that there's some sort of battle going on between the Dagonites and the servants of Cthulhu, who are being imprisoned and experimented upon. Although this doesn't really go very far, we just get hints at a much bigger story. And only after the final boss fight, where we go to the end cutscene, do we see some sort of attempt to tie in everything that's been happening to the prologue with the great race of Yith, and sort of to Cthulhu and the Dagonites. Really, this was an adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth, not Call of Cthulhu. Cthulhu is only a peripheral member of what's going on, presumably just tacked on in order to have the more recognizable Cthulhu name. Why didn't they just go with Cthulhu? Well anyway, the ending is a fairly unsatisfying experience because they seem to be setting all of this game up to be a sort of preamble to the real story that's going to involve some sort of interspecies conflict between various elder things and their servitor creatures. There were originally a number of sequels that were planned to this game, and this was a long-standing project by Headfirst Games. It was originally designed back in 1999, and it took several years before it was eventually put onto the Xbox, so they really believed in this project, and I don't want to make it seem like they were hucksters or anything. I think they're excellent game designers. It's just I don't know if they necessarily went in the right direction with this particular game. There was some sort of error that was made, and I want to know how it became a shooter. I just feel that a company that was known for making point-and-click adventure games and started this game, which began as a combat-free hour of adventure game playing, and then kind of randomly turned into a shooter. Were they forced at gunpoint to make it a shooter because that was the popular game at the time and didn't really want to? Or was that their plan from the start and everything just went disastrously wrong? So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about Dark Corners of the Earth, a game that I really wanted to love, a game that I was so psyched for, I was so into, that the immense disappointment made me realize that there may be some other people out there that are going to go to this game and then come away with it with a really bad impression of the idea of adapting Lovecraft into video games, because unlike some people, I do not take a defeatist attitude about adapting Lovecraft. I think you absolutely can adapt them into video games, into movies, and that it is not an impossibility to adapt cosmic horror. It is definitely possible. And certain films, like The Thing or Alien, have shown us the way, and certain video games that have come out recently have also shown us the way. With a more action-oriented approach came Bloodborne. With a more adventure game approach, we got Amnesia: The Dark Descent and its sequel, and also recently The Shore and Canarium. And I think that we can really do a great job adapting Lovecraft into video games. So I just wanted to make my own little contribution to what I think would make a good Lovecraftian horror game. And one of the rules to follow, I think, is stop adapting Shadow over Innsmouth, because it's kind of been done to death. And to be honest, it's a little bit more of a comedic story than people give it credit for. The fish monsters are a little bit more on the funny side, and I think Lovecraft may have even known that himself, rather than the truly soul-destroying sense of cosmic horror that we would get if we were battling the impossible elder deities like Yog-Sothoth or Azathoth or something like that. Next up is to de-emphasize combat. I'm not saying get rid of combat. You don't have to do that at all. In fact, I'd probably prefer it to sneaking around like we did in the more recent Call of Cthulhu game that came out a few years ago. But I think that you would have to drastically change the combat to focus more on the monstrous creatures. One of the developers of Dark Corners of the Earth actually said that he wanted to not show the monstrous figures at first and have us fighting the standard cultists, but I personally feel that's wrong, because it's just boring fighting a random dude with a gun. It doesn't feel exciting. It doesn't feel truly horrific. It's something that could really happen in any game. And we don't really get a look at the gruesome monstrosities of Nightmare. Like in the recent game, The Shore, we got to fight the monstrous psychic id force or unconscious of Cthulhu or something like that. I forget how they explained it, but it was very different from some random guy with, a shotgun. And the combat, it should go without saying, it should be brutal, ugly, heinous, and terrible. We should take a sanity loss for killing anyone, not just be able to mow down 100 fishmen without it really affecting us. And finally, and most importantly, I think that you should find a way to balance the immediate concerns of someone trying to investigate the Mountains of Madness or stop the cult of Cthulhu, figuring out why an Arkham professor put his brain into a jar so he can go into outer space and talk with aliens on another planet. The more, it's odd to say this, but more physical, mundane concerns. And in a Lovecraftian story, those probably would be more mundane than the truly beyond the scope of human understanding cosmic scale of things that we would on a higher level in dealing with creatures like Azathoth or the Elder Gods and humanity's inherent frailty and insignificance in the grander scheme of things. Find a way to balance those two, and I think you'd have a truly great game. And again, as I said at the beginning, I want to know what you think makes a good Lovecraft game, and how we should avoid some of the mistakes I think that went into making this one. This game has actually received a little bit of positive attention here and there, with some people trying to reclaim it as a hidden gem, and keeping in mind I say this with love, I don't think it is a hidden gem. I think it was rightly castigated by people at the time and rightly ignored. Unfortunately, I really wish that I could say otherwise, but it's just not a very good game. It's not a diamond in the rough. And I want to use this experience not to just attack this game, but to try to figure out a way to determine some steps we could take, some rules to follow in order to make a good Lovecraftian game. And many people, I think, are already following this. Dark Corners of the Earth was a tragedy in many ways because the company actually wanted to make even more Cthulhu-based games, and we came very close to getting some new ones. There was going to be one based on the Mountains of Madness, and maybe they would have learned a little bit from their experience at the Dark Corners of the Earth and fixed those gameplay issues. But it's also very possible that if they made those games, they would have been identical to Dark Corners of the Earth in style and learned nothing. I mean, who knows what would have happened. But yeah, that's really all I have to say. My name is Michael. This is Cthulhu. He wants to destroy your soul. And yeah, please tell me what you think of this game, and tell me if I'm wrong. I know I'm going to hear that a lot, because this game has its defenders, but I want to hear it. I'd tell you to have a good night, but obviously, you know, our immortal souls are damned in the empty void of the cosmos to the whims of the insane, blithering idiot dark gods. You know the drill.
Though eternity lies before thee, thy work in the land of the living is not done. Return, brave ones.
And watch more videos.